The sports world doesn't just love a feud. It needs one. It needs two stars to stand on opposite sides of an invisible line so the audience can pick teams, argue all night, and refresh the timeline like it's breaking news. And when the sport is women's basketball, that need gets even uglier, because the machine has a favorite storyline it never stops recycling. Two queens can't share one throne. For the last few years, that exact script has been shoved onto Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark like it was destiny. The UConn prodigy versus the Iowa phenomenon. The pure hooper versus the viral sniper. The clean game versus chaos. And if you paid attention, you could literally see how the story was manufactured. Every clip got slowed down. Every facial expression got studied like body language experts were on payroll. Every stat line became a weapon. Every time one of them had a big game, someone would immediately twist it into a message aimed at the other. And the wild part is, most people started believing it. Not because Paige ever said she hated Caitlin. Not because Caitlin ever threw real shade at Paige. But because the media doesn't need a direct quote to create a feud. It just needs space. Silence. One awkward moment. One vague answer. One no comment. And then it fills the gap with whatever gets the most clicks. Is Paige secretly bitter? Is Caitlin threatened? Who really owns the spotlight? That's how the machine works. It takes two successful women, puts them in a box, locks the lid, and shakes it until something spills. But then something happened that broke the whole illusion. Not a rumor. Not a source close to the situation. Not a debate segment with dramatic music. It was something the media can't easily argue with. Actual footage. Real interactions. Real basketball. A few grainy clips from a USA basketball training environment that were never supposed to become the center of the conversation. Clips that didn't show tension, cold shoulders, or ego. They showed something way more dangerous to the rivalry economy. They showed chemistry. And once people saw that, the entire narrative started wobbling. Because when two players are supposedly locked in a bitter personal war, you don't expect them to look comfortable sharing the same backcourt. You don't expect them to laugh. You don't expect them to communicate like teammates. You don't expect the game to look effortless. Then the second thing happened. The thing that turned this from interesting footage into a full-blown storyline reversal. The microphones turned on. And Paige didn't do what everyone expected. She didn't give the standard athlete response that keeps everyone guessing. She didn't play the respectfully, I focus on my team card. She didn't dodge. She didn't smirk and move on. She went straight into the details, like she was breaking down film for a coach, not feeding a gossip cycle. And what she said didn't just soften the rivalry narrative. It exposed it. Because when a player at Paige's level talks about Caitlin Clark in a way that's that specific, that confident, and that respectful, it forces a different question. Not, do they hate each other? Not, who's better? But something much bigger, and honestly much more uncomfortable for the people who profit off the feud. What if the rivalry was never real? And the real threat is what happens when they stop letting the outside world divide them. That's the part people weren't ready for. Because if Paige and Caitlin aren't enemies, then a lot of the anger floating around the sport doesn't make sense anymore. A lot of the drama looks staged. A lot of the debate shows suddenly feel like wrestling promos. And it forces you to look at the basketball world with new eyes. Because the truth isn't just that they respect each other. The truth is that, together, they might represent something the old power structure can't control. And the proof started with a training camp that turned into an accidental leak. And a few moments on camera that made the entire internet go quiet for a second. That's where this story really begins. On paper, the USA basketball training camp was supposed to be routine. Closed gym. Controlled access. Elite players sharpening instincts away from cameras and noise. No drama, no narratives, just reps. But camps like this are never just about basketball. They're pressure cookers. You throw legends, established pros, rising stars, and future faces of the league into one space, and everyone walks in knowing they're being evaluated, even when nobody says it out loud. That's why expectations were low-key toxic before the first clip even leaked. Think about the context. Caitlin Clark, a rookie already carrying more attention than some veterans have in their entire careers, walks into a gym with players who've spent years building the league without that spotlight. She's been face-guarded, bumped off ball, talked about in coded language on podcasts. She's been warned that reality is coming. She's been told she needs to adjust, to humble herself, to survive the physicality. Meanwhile, Paige Bueckers shows up with her own invisible weight. 3 years of rehab, lost seasons, and a narrative that says she was the chosen one before injuries hit pause on everything. If there was ever a setup for tension, this was it. Most people expected separation. Different drill lines. Minimal interaction. Polite professionalism at best. The cameras were ready for awkward silences and clipped body language. That's what the rivalry economy feeds on. And for a moment, it felt like the script was already written before the ball even hit the floor. Then the footage hit social media. Grainy. Short. Clearly not meant for public consumption. And yet, in those few seconds, the entire tone shifted. Instead of distance, Paige and Caitlin were right there together. Same side of the floor, same rhythm, same pace. They weren't taking turns. They weren't competing for touches. They were flowing. Running actions like they'd been teammates for years instead of players the internet insisted were enemies. You could see it in the little things. Paige drifting into open space without calling for the ball. Caitlin reading it instantly. No hesitation. No forced pass. Just instinct. Caitlin's range pulled defenders out of position, stretching the floor until it looked unnatural. Paige slipped into the gaps like she knew exactly where the defense would crack. High fives after plays. Quick smiles. A level of comfort that doesn't exist if there's even a hint of resentment. And that's what made it unsettling. Because this wasn't a friendly warm-up clip. This was high-level basketball chemistry happening in real time, under real scrutiny. The kind of chemistry coaches spend entire seasons trying to build. The kind that usually only forms after shared losses, long road trips, and late-night film sessions. Except here, it appeared in minutes. For fans watching, there was a quiet realization happening at the same time. If these two are supposed to be rivals, then why does the game look easier when they're on the floor together? Why does the defense look confused instead of confident? Why does everything suddenly feel natural? That question alone was enough to crack the narrative. But the visual evidence was only half the story. Clips can be misinterpreted. Body language can be spun. The media can always say, "It's just practice." They can downplay chemistry if it doesn't fit the agenda. That's why what happened next mattered more than anything that happened on the court. Because once Paige sat down and actually spoke, without dodging, without smiling through vague answers, the storyline lost its escape route. And that's where things went from uncomfortable to undeniable. When the interview started, it didn't feel explosive. There was no dramatic setup, no viral quote pulled out of context, no headline-ready sound bite waiting to be clipped. And that's exactly why it was dangerous. Because this wasn't Paige Bueckers speaking in headlines. This was Paige speaking like someone who understands the game at a level most conversations never reach. When she was asked about Caitlin Clark, the expectation was simple. A polite compliment. Something safe. She's a great player. She's obviously talented. The kind of answer that gives nothing away and keeps every narrative alive. That's usually how athletes protect themselves from being misinterpreted. Paige didn't do that. She went straight into the details. Not the flashy stuff everyone argues about online. Not the logo threes or the scoring records that dominate highlight reels. She talked about Caitlin's passing. Her vision. Her ability to control pace. The way she reads defenders before they even commit. And that's when the tone shifted, because casual praise is easy to fake. Technical respect isn't. When a player like Paige breaks down another guard's game that specifically, it sends a clear signal. This isn't admiration from a distance. This is film study respect. This is someone who's actually watched possessions unfold, not just points accumulate. She pointed out how difficult Caitlin's role is, how much decision-making she carries every single night, how much attention she draws, and how little margin for error that leaves. What stood out wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. There was no edge. No competitiveness leaking through the cracks. No, I see her, but energy. Just calm, matter-of-fact acknowledgement. Paige called Caitlin a generational talent without flinching. And in a media environment where players often avoid that phrase unless it's about themselves or retired legends, that word choice mattered. Because Paige is a competitor. She wants to be the best. She's not built to hand out crowns. So when she uses language like that, it's not surrender. It's confidence. It's the kind of security that only comes from knowing your own ceiling doesn't shrink just because someone else is shining. And that's where the interview quietly blew up the entire feud narrative. If Paige was secretly bitter, this was the moment to hide it. If she felt overshadowed, this was the chance to minimize. If there was jealousy simmering under the surface, it would have leaked out in tone, in hesitation, in deflection. Instead, what came through was something the media hates trying to package: sincerity. In a league where players sometimes like shady tweets or throw subtle jabs in post-game comments, Paige did the opposite. She elevated the conversation. She reframed Caitlin's impact as something complex, not controversial. And in doing so, she made a lot of existing discourse look shallow. The timing made it even heavier. This wasn't a college kid talking about another college kid. This was a future #1 pick speaking about a rookie who's already dealing with pro-level scrutiny. Paige didn't just praise the game, she acknowledged the pressure. She recognized the spotlight. She validated the burden without making it sound like a complaint. That kind of acknowledgement does two things at once. It humanizes Caitlin in a space where she's often treated like a lightning rod. And it exposes how unserious a lot of the surrounding debate really is. Because when one of the most respected players in the pipeline speaks that clearly, it becomes harder to pretend the tension is mutual. And that's why this interview didn't get the coverage you'd expect. There's no easy headline in "Paige explains why Caitlin is elite." There's no outrage cycle. No teams to pick. No comment section war. Respect doesn't trend the way resentment does. So instead of amplifying it, some outlets quietly buried it, hoping the moment would pass. But it didn't. Because once people heard Paige speak, the next question became unavoidable. If she's this secure, this complimentary, and this aware, why is the environment around Caitlin so hostile? And to answer that, you have to look at Paige's own story. Because if anyone had a reason to feel a certain type of way, it was her. To understand why Paige Bueckers' words mattered so much, you have to rewind a few years and strip the story down to what it actually felt like in real time. Before the injuries. Before the rehab updates. Before the what-if conversations became routine. There was a stretch where Paige wasn't just a star. She was the future of women's basketball. She arrived at UConn and immediately changed the temperature of the sport. Freshman of the Year. National Player of the Year. Effortless scoring. Defensive instincts. A game that looked clean in a way people rarely see at that age. The league and the media didn't just like her, they were preparing her. Sponsorships followed. The spotlight was warm, not blinding. Everything was lined up. Then the injuries hit. And there's a specific kind of mental weight that comes with that. It's not just pain or rehab or missing games. It's watching the sport move forward without you while you're stuck doing controlled movements in an empty gym. It's checking box scores when you'd rather not. It's seeing new stars emerge while you're trying to remember what it feels like to trust your body again. During that exact window, Caitlin Clark didn't just rise. She exploded. Records fell. Arenas sold out. Television numbers spiked. Her range became a talking point even outside basketball circles. The attention didn't drift, it locked in. And suddenly, the narrative shifted. Caitlin became the face of the moment. The one everyone talked about. The one people built arguments around. This is where bitterness usually grows. Most athletes won't admit it, but that combination, injury, silence, and watching someone else take over the spotlight, breaks people. It creates resentment. It fuels quiet comparisons. It makes every praise of the other player feel personal, even when it's not meant to be. If Paige had leaned into that, nobody would have blamed her. She could have played the distance game. She could have kept answers short. She could have framed everything as, "We're different players," and let fans fill in the blanks. She could have let the rivalry breathe without ever feeding it directly. That's the easy path. That's the path most people take when they feel like something was taken from them. She didn't. Instead, what we saw at USA Basketball, and what we heard in that interview, was someone who processed all of that without letting it calcify into insecurity. Paige didn't talk like someone trying to reclaim a throne. She talked like someone who knows her place doesn't disappear just because someone else occupies a different lane. That's what separates confidence from ego. Ego needs comparison. It needs hierarchy. It needs someone else to lose so it can feel validated. Confidence doesn't. Confidence allows room. It recognizes greatness without feeling smaller because of it. And Paige's reaction to Caitlyn's rise revealed which one she's operating from. It also exposed something else that people don't like to say out loud. A lot of the tension surrounding Caitlin Clark isn't about competition. It's about insecurity. Not from players like Paige, who understand their value and their trajectory, but from spaces that feel their status slipping. When Paige praises Caitlin openly, it highlights the contrast. It shows that resentment isn't inevitable. It's chosen. And that's why her stance hits harder than any fan debate. Because if the player who lost seasons to injury, watched the spotlight shift, and still walked back onto the court without bitterness can speak with that much respect, then the negativity elsewhere starts looking less like toughness and more like fear. Paige's behavior reframed the entire situation. It suggested that what's happening in the league isn't rookies being disrespectful or stars being threatened by talent. It's a generational shift colliding with an environment that wasn't prepared for how fast things would change. But emotion is only part of the story. Because once you move past the psychology, the basketball itself explains a lot. And when you actually break down why Paige and Caitlin work so well together, the conversation stops being about rivalry at all. It becomes about something much more alarming for anyone who has to guard them. Once you strip away the noise, the hashtags, and the debates that live entirely on timelines, the reason Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark work together becomes almost obvious. It's not magic. It's not hype. It's basketball logic. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Caitlin Clark is a system bender. Her range doesn't just extend the floor, it distorts it. Defenses can't guard her the way they guard anyone else, because normal rules stop applying once someone is comfortable pulling up from distances that are supposed to be safe. The moment she crosses half court, the defense has to make a decision. Step up and risk getting burned, or sit back and give her a clean look. Either choice creates stress. That stress is chaos. And chaos is where Caitlin thrives. She doesn't just score out of it. She manipulates it. She forces defenders to lean, hesitate, overhelp. She drags two people toward the ball and then releases it at exactly the wrong moment for the defense. That's why her passing is so important, and why it often gets overlooked. When you're creating that much pressure, every read matters more. Every half-second decision carries consequences. Paige Bueckers is built to punish those consequences. Her game isn't loud. It's efficient. She doesn't need the ball to feel involved, and that's rare for a player with her skill level. She understands timing in a way that doesn't show up in box scores. When defenders shift toward Caitlin, Paige is already moving. Cutting behind ball-watching defenders. Slipping into soft spots in the lane. Relocating without signaling for attention. In the practice clips, you could see it clearly. Caitlin brings the ball up. The defense creeps forward. 2 steps closer than they should be. That's all Paige needs. 1 step into space, 1 cut at the right angle, and the defense is already late. Caitlin sees it instantly. The pass arrives on time, on target, and the possession is over before the defense realizes what just happened. This is why they don't clash. High-usage players usually cannibalize each other. They fight for rhythm. They take turns instead of flowing. Think about how long it takes most star pairings to figure out spacing, timing, and trust. It's messy. It's awkward. It takes months of reps and uncomfortable adjustments. Paige and Caitlin skipped that stage. Because they don't overlap. Caitlin creates gravity. Paige exploits gravity. Caitlin stretches defenses horizontally. Paige attacks vertically. One bends the court. The other reads the bend and slices through it. It's a clean division of labor that doesn't require ego checks or hierarchy negotiations. That's what makes the combination so unsettling. And when you place that pairing in a Team USA environment, the implications get bigger fast. International defenses are disciplined, but they're not built for that kind of spacing pressure. They rely on compactness, on shrinking the floor, on forcing contested shots. Caitlin blows that up the moment she crosses the logo. Paige finishes the breakdown with precision. You don't need a full game sample to see it. You can feel it in the flow, in how easy the game looks when they're connected, in how defenders look a step behind even in practice. Basketball at that level doesn't lie. If it works immediately, it's because the fit is real. And once you recognize that, the conversation shifts again. Because this isn't just about two stars getting along. It's about what happens when the future of the sport starts organizing itself naturally, without asking permission. That's why people started whispering about the Olympics. About 2028. About what it would look like if this backcourt actually had time to develop in a real competitive setting. Because the potential isn't theoretical anymore. It's visible. And Paige knew exactly what she was doing when she talked about the physicality next. Because she wasn't just analyzing the game. She was defending someone who's already feeling the weight of the league. When Paige shifted the conversation toward physicality, it didn't sound accidental. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't emotional. It was measured, deliberate, and precise, just like her game. She acknowledged how physical the professional level is, how demanding it becomes when defenses decide to test you, and how much wear that puts on a player over time. On the surface, it sounded like a neutral observation. But anyone listening closely understood what she was really doing. She was validating Caitlin Clark. Not in a dramatic way. Not by complaining. Not by feeding into the ongoing arguments about fouls or fairness. She did something much smarter. She normalized the struggle. She framed it as reality, not weakness. By doing that, she cut through one of the most toxic loops surrounding Caitlin's rookie season. The idea that acknowledging physical play somehow means you're not tough enough. Paige knows better than most how narratives like that work. She's lived inside them. She's watched how quickly praise turns into scrutiny, how confidence gets rebranded as entitlement, and how attention can turn hostile once it stops being convenient. When she spoke about the physical toll, she wasn't just talking as an observer. She was talking as someone preparing to walk into the same environment. That's what made it powerful. Because Paige isn't far away from this reality. She's projected to be the top pick. She's about to enter a league where rookies don't get eased in, they get tested. Full court pressure. Hard bumps. Subtle messages delivered through contact. The same welcome to the league energy Caitlin is experiencing now will be waiting for Paige when she arrives. By aligning herself with Caitlin publicly, Paige wasn't just showing empathy. She was drawing a line. She was saying, without saying it outright, I see what's happening. I understand it. And I'm not pretending it's imaginary. That matters because silence is what allows narratives to metastasize. When no one speaks, speculation fills the gap. Paige didn't leave a gap. She spoke calmly and clearly, which made it harder to twist her words into something else. This is where the dynamic shifted from individual respect to something closer to unity. For a long time, the WNBA conversation has been framed as rookies versus veterans, attention versus tradition, hype versus substance. Paige's comments disrupted that framing. She didn't side with the noise. She didn't side against it either. She reframed the situation as what it actually is. A generational transition happening in real time, with friction as a natural byproduct. And by doing that, she subtly removed Caitlin from the problem category. Caitlin wasn't being painted as someone who complains or exaggerates. She was being positioned as someone carrying an unusually heavy load, defensive attention, media scrutiny, and physical pressure, all at once. Coming from Paige, that reframing carried weight. It wasn't a fan defending her favorite player. It wasn't a commentator pushing an angle. It was a peer acknowledging reality. That's why this moment landed differently. Because once one of the most respected young players in the pipeline says it out loud, it forces everyone else to respond. You can't dismiss it as excuses anymore. You can't pretend it's just noise. You either engage honestly with what's happening, or you look like you're avoiding it. And that's exactly why the conversation got uncomfortable. Because Paige didn't just defend Caitlyn. She exposed how fragile some of the surrounding discourse really is. She made it clear that toughness and acknowledgement are not opposites. That respecting the grind doesn't mean denying its cost. And that understanding the game at a high level means recognizing when a player is being targeted, not pretending it's business as usual. This wasn't drama. It was awareness. And awareness, in a league going through a power shift, is far more threatening than any manufactured rivalry. What Paige did with that interview didn't just defend Caitlin Clark. It quietly dismantled the entire media ecosystem that had been feeding off their supposed rivalry. Because the machine that thrives on conflict depends on one thing above all else: ambiguity. As long as players stay vague, analysts can fill the silence with speculation. As long as no one speaks clearly, narratives can be invented, recycled, and monetized. Paige didn't give them that space. By speaking directly, specifically, and confidently, she removed the fog. And once the fog clears, a lot of the drama evaporates. The familiar headlines suddenly stop working. Does Paige resent Caitlyn? Doesn't make sense when Paige has just spent several minutes breaking down Caitlyn's game like a coach in a film room. Is there tension between the two? Falls flat when the footage shows chemistry and the words confirm it. This is why the interview didn't dominate sports shows the way it should have. There's no easy argument to build when respect is explicit. You can't pit players against each other when one of them refuses to play along. You can't fuel fan wars when the stars themselves are actively cooling things down. That kind of clarity is bad for business in an attention economy that thrives on outrage. So instead of amplifying the interview, some outlets minimized it. They shifted focus. They talked around it. They returned to safer debates that didn't require recalibration. Because acknowledging what Paige said would mean admitting that a lot of previous coverage was exaggerated at best, misleading at worst. And that's where the isolation effect starts. Once Paige publicly positions herself the way she did, anyone who continues to throw shade at Caitlyn loses the ability to hide behind "everyone feels this way." No, everyone doesn't. One of the most respected young players in the game doesn't. And that contrast makes bitterness stand out in high definition. This is how narratives collapse. Not with explosions, but with clarity. The irony is that Paige didn't attack anyone. She didn't accuse. She didn't call out specific players or media members. She just told the truth in a way that made everything else look exaggerated. And that's often more damaging than direct criticism. Because now, when fans look back at months of heated debates, they see them differently. They see how much of it was built on assumption instead of evidence. They see how often silence was misinterpreted as animosity. And they start asking questions about who actually benefited from keeping the rivalry alive. That shift matters. It forces the audience to grow up with the sport. It moves the conversation away from soap opera dynamics and back toward basketball. And that's exactly what Paige did by refusing to play the role assigned to her. But the impact doesn't stop with media narratives. Because once you remove the artificial conflict, something else becomes visible. Something the league hasn't fully prepared for yet. The business implications of what Paige and Caitlyn represent together. Once you remove the fake rivalry layer, what's left is something far more significant than personality drama. Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark aren't just two elite players coexisting. They are, objectively, the two most valuable growth engines women's basketball has produced at the same time. And that's where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Individually, both are already economic forces. Ticket sales spike when their names appear on schedules. Television ratings jump. Social engagement multiplies. Brand partnerships follow them, not the other way around. Nil valuations, endorsement leverage, and global recognition aren't projections anymore. They're current realities. Together, they're an economy. That's why the idea of a rivalry never made sense from a long-term perspective. Rivalries burn fast. They spike attention briefly and then collapse under their own weight. Unity, on the other hand, scales. When two stars elevate each other instead of tearing each other down, the entire ecosystem grows. Paige understands this. Caitlin understands this. And whether consciously or instinctively, their actions reflect it. If Caitlin brings millions of new eyes into the WNBA, Paige benefits the moment she steps into the league. Higher viewership means more revenue. More revenue strengthens salary negotiations, marketing budgets, and broadcast leverage. When Paige arrives, she's not entering the league that existed 5 years ago. She's entering a bigger one, partly because of Caitlin's impact. And the reverse is just as true. Paige brings a massive, deeply loyal fanbase with her. UConn isn't just a program, it's a global brand in women's basketball. When Paige transitions to the pros, those fans follow. They buy tickets. They tune in. They engage. That growth lifts Caitlin's visibility even further, because stars don't exist in isolation. They exist in ecosystems. This is why their collaboration, even in something as small as a practice clip, matters more than people realize. Every moment they're seen supporting each other adds value to the sport. It reassures sponsors. It attracts new audiences. It tells casual fans this isn't a divided space filled with resentment. It's a competitive environment with mutual respect at the top. And from a business standpoint, that's gold. Fabricated rivalries might generate clicks today, but they come with a cost. They fracture fan bases. They create toxic loyalty tests. They turn growth into zero-sum thinking. Paige and Caitlin are operating on a different timeline. They're not chasing viral moments. They're building careers inside a league that's still defining its future. That's why this interview felt strategic without sounding calculated. Paige didn't talk about branding or money, but her words functioned like long-term investment signals. She positioned herself as aligned with the sport's growth, not just her own success. She made it clear that the rise of one star doesn't require the fall of another. And once that framing exists, it becomes harder for anyone, media, fans, or even league stakeholders, to push a narrative that contradicts it without looking out of touch. But there's another layer to this alliance that goes beyond economics. Because when players with this much visibility start showing leadership qualities this early, it changes who holds cultural power inside the league. What made Paige Bueckers' interview so effective is that it never announced itself as leadership. There was no speech, no manifesto, no attempt to sound like the future face of the league. And that's exactly why it worked. Real leadership rarely introduces itself. It shows up quietly, reframes the moment, and lets everyone else catch up. Right now, the WNBA is in a transitional phase that doesn't get talked about enough. The legends who defined the previous era are stepping away. The cultural anchors of the league, the voices everyone looked to for tone setting, are no longer on the court every night. That leaves a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty for long. Someone always fills them. Caitlin Clark is the most visible player in the league, but visibility isn't the same as authority. Popularity brings attention, not always trust. It makes you a lightning rod before it makes you a leader. Paige, on the other hand, occupies a different space. She's respected across fan bases. She's seen as a hooper's hooper. Her game translates cleanly. Her demeanor disarms conflict instead of attracting it. By openly praising Caitlin, Paige did more than show respect. She positioned herself as a bridge. She connected college fans to pro fans, old-school basketball minds to the new wave. People who feel protective of the league's history to people excited about its future. That kind of positioning doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone understands the politics of a space as well as the skill. And the way she handled it exposed a gap. A lot of the tension surrounding Caitlin comes from uncertainty, about how much attention one player should have, about whether hype threatens tradition, about who controls the narrative. Paige didn't amplify that fear. She diffused it. She treated Caitlin's success as additive, not destabilizing. That's leadership language, even when it doesn't sound like it. It also explains why the interview made some people uncomfortable. Because when a young player demonstrates that level of awareness, it raises questions about who's actually equipped to guide the league through its next phase. Paige didn't attack the old guard, But her composure made some of the surrounding noise look unprepared. She showed that you can be competitive without being combative. That you can acknowledge pressure without framing yourself as a victim. That you can be honest without feeding chaos. Those are skills that matter off the court as much as on it. And the most interesting part is that Paige didn't center herself in any of it. She talked about reads, spacing, physicality, game flow. She refused to engage in emotional bait. She brought the conversation back to basketball over and over again. That's not accidental. That's discipline. It's also a quiet refusal to let the sport turn into reality TV. But there was one moment, easy to miss, where the subtext got even deeper. A brief clip from the same training camp showed Paige and Caitlin sitting together on the sideline. No microphones. No context. Just body language. Leaning in. Focused. Serious. Then laughing. It didn't look performative. It looked familiar. And that's where the story shifted again. Because whatever was said in that moment didn't need to be heard to be understood. That sideline moment didn't go viral because there was no audio. No quote to screenshot. No sentence to twist into a headline. Just two players sitting close, leaning in, talking like people who don't need to perform for anyone watching. And in a media environment that survives on overheard drama, that silence said more than any soundbite could. Because there are only a handful of people on the planet who actually understand what Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark are dealing with right now. Not the fans. Not the analysts. Not the commentators paid to argue both sides of the same point. Only players who've lived inside that level of attention know what it feels like when your name stops being just a name and turns into a symbol. When every game becomes a referendum. When praise feels conditional. When criticism feels personal even if it isn't meant to be. That shared experience creates a bond that doesn't show up in box scores. Whatever Paige and Caitlin were talking about on that bench, it wasn't surface level. You could see it in the body language. The way they leaned forward. The nods. The half-smiles that come from recognition, not humor. It looked like two people comparing notes. On defenses. On physicality. On the weird energy that comes from being talked about more than you're listened to. And that kind of conversation doesn't happen between rivals. It happens between peers. This is where the manufactured feud completely collapses. Because rivalry implies distance. It implies separation. It implies that success for one threatens the other. That moment on the sideline suggested the opposite. It suggested alignment. It suggested mutual understanding. And it suggested that both players are thinking beyond the next game. For Caitlin, that matters more than people realize. She's been placed in a position that's both powerful and isolating. She's the most watched player in the league, but that visibility has come with skepticism, policing, and an expectation that she absorb everything without reacting. Paige's public and private support acts as a pressure release. It confirms that Caitlin isn't imagining the environment she's navigating. And for Paige, that conversation is preparation. She knows what's coming. She knows the attention won't stay gentle forever. She knows the honeymoon phase ends quickly at the pro level. By aligning herself early with someone already carrying that weight, she's not just being supportive, she's learning. She's studying the terrain before she has to walk it herself. This is how coalitions form. Not through press conferences, but through shared experience. And once that coalition becomes visible, even subtly, it changes the math. It signals to the league that the next generation isn't arriving fragmented and insecure. They're arriving connected, aware, and unwilling to be divided for entertainment. That's what makes this moment bigger than two players getting along. It's a glimpse of how power is shifting inside women's basketball. Away from artificial hierarchies and toward players who understand that unity doesn't weaken competition, it strengthens it. And that shift doesn't stop at culture. Because once you look at history, you start to see patterns. And the patterns suggest that moments like this don't stay contained forever. If this moment feels familiar, that's because we've seen versions of it before, just not often in women's basketball, and not this early. In other sports, these quiet alignments tend to show up years before anything tangible happens. A shared run. A national team environment. A stretch of time where competitors realize they aren't actually enemies, they're reflections. Those moments don't announce themselves as turning points. They sit quietly in the background until, years later, people look back and say, that's where it started. In the men's game, this pattern is almost routine. Players meet through international competition. They share locker rooms, frustrations, and the strange weight of expectation that comes with being elite. They learn how each other thinks, how each other moves. And long before any contract is signed, the idea gets planted. Not as a plan, but as a possibility. That's what made the USA basketball setting so important. It wasn't about forming a super team tomorrow. It wasn't about recruitment. It was about familiarity. About seeing how the game feels when you don't have to explain your instincts to the person next to you. When spacing makes sense without talking. When reads happen without eye contact. Those experiences stay with players. So when people start speculating about the future, about Olympics, about potential pairings, about what the league might look like 5 years from now, it's not fantasy. It's pattern recognition. The seeds don't guarantee anything, but they matter. They change how players think about their careers, their leverage, and their options. And here's the part that really unsettles the old narrative. This doesn't require Paige and Caitlin to ever play on the same professional team to be powerful. The alignment itself already is. The mutual respect. The refusal to be weaponized against each other. The understanding that they are stronger pushing the sport forward together than competing for attention inside a shrinking box. That mindset alone alters the balance of power. It tells the league that future stars are paying attention. That they're learning from what's happening now. That they're not going to accept being isolated, tested, and pitted against each other in silence. It signals that the next generation values collaboration without sacrificing competitiveness. And that's not something you can regulate with rules or messaging. It's cultural. The irony is that the rivalry storyline was supposed to make the sport feel bigger, louder, more dramatic. But what Paige and Caitlin accidentally revealed is that the sport might actually grow faster when it stops pretending its stars need to hate each other to matter. That's a harder story to sell in the short term. But in the long term, it's the kind of story that changes everything. And that's why this moment didn't end with a clip or an interview. It lingered. Because once fans see through the illusion, they don't unsee it. And once players realize they don't have to accept the roles written for them, they start writing their own. The only question left is how the league, and the audience, chooses to respond when that future fully arrives. Once the illusion cracks, it doesn't just change how players move. It changes how fans move too. And that might be the most underestimated part of this entire story. For years, the Paige versus Caitlin debate turned fanbases into factions. UConn fans felt like they had to defend Paige's legacy every time Caitlin broke another record. Iowa fans felt like Caitlin had to be protected from constant dismissal and gatekeeping. Neutral fans were pushed to pick a side, even if they just wanted to enjoy good basketball. The result wasn't growth. It was fragmentation. That kind of division exhausts people. It creates an environment where watching the game feels like participating in an argument instead of appreciating skill. Where liking one player is treated as disrespecting another. Where social media rewards hostility more than understanding. And over time, casual fans drift away because the noise becomes louder than the sport. This is where Paige's interview quietly gave fans permission to reset. When players at the center of the supposed rivalry refuse to feed it, the audience has to recalibrate. It becomes harder to justify the anger. Harder to frame appreciation as betrayal. Harder to keep fighting a war the main characters aren't participating in. That's powerful. Because fans don't just consume narratives, they amplify them. When fans stop engaging with artificial conflict, media incentives change. Coverage shifts. Conversations evolve. The tone of the sport matures. And that's how leagues stabilize after periods of rapid growth. What Paige did wasn't just about Caitlin. It was about signaling to the audience that women's basketball doesn't need soap opera dynamics to be compelling. The skill is enough. The stakes are real. The personalities don't need to be exaggerated into caricatures. And Caitlin's role in this matters too. By staying focused on the game and letting others speak when necessary, she's avoided escalating the tension. She hasn't clapped back. She hasn't chased validation. She's absorbed attention and kept playing. That restraint, combined with Paige's clarity, creates a new tone, one where excellence doesn't require animosity. This is the moment where the sport can choose direction. If fans lean into unity, appreciation, and informed debate, the league grows cleaner and stronger. If they cling to manufactured beef, the conversation stays stuck in loops that don't serve anyone long-term. Paige and Caitlin have already made their choice. They've shown what maturity looks like at the highest level. Now the audience decides whether it follows. Because growth isn't just about ratings and sponsorships. It's about culture. About whether a sport can evolve past the narratives that once kept it small. And moments like this, quiet, unspectacular on the surface, are often the ones that determine which path gets taken. The rivalry didn't end with an announcement. It ended because it was never real in the first place. When you zoom out far enough, what makes this entire situation feel different isn't the praise, the clips, or even the speculation. It's the fact that, for the first time in a long while, the conversation was dragged back to basketball by the people actually playing it. That doesn't happen often. Most modern sports narratives drift further away from the court the bigger the spotlight gets. The game becomes background noise to personalities, drama, and debate segments built for engagement instead of understanding. Women's basketball has been especially vulnerable to that trap because attention is still new enough that it's treated as something fragile, something that needs conflict to survive. Paige Bueckers rejected that idea without ever saying she was rejecting it. By talking about reads, spacing, and physicality, she forced everyone listening to recalibrate what mattered. By refusing to speculate on feelings, she denied the media the emotional fuel it was waiting for. By focusing on Caitlin Clark's actual skill set, she reframed the conversation around why Caitlin is effective, not whether she's polarizing. And Caitlin's response, measured, quiet, focused, completed the shift. Together, they did something subtle but significant. They showed that the sport doesn't collapse when stars stop feeding drama. It stabilizes. It becomes clearer. It invites deeper appreciation instead of surface-level outrage. And that's a dangerous realization for anyone who built a narrative economy on the opposite assumption. This moment also exposed a deeper truth about where women's basketball is right now. The sport is no longer fighting for relevance. It's fighting for direction. Relevance can be forced. Direction can't. Direction comes from the people at the center of the game deciding what kind of environment they're willing to participate in. Paige and Caitlin made it clear, without coordinating, without announcing, that they're not interested in being divided for entertainment. That doesn't mean competition disappears. If anything, it sharpens. Because competition rooted in respect is cleaner, more focused, and harder to dismiss. It forces defenders to guard skill instead of narratives. It forces critics to engage with substance instead of speculation. And that's exactly why this moment matters more than the clips themselves. It signals a future where the biggest names in the sport don't need manufactured tension to carry attention. Where fans don't need to choose sides to feel invested. Where basketball can be analyzed, criticized, and celebrated without being reduced to a feud. That future isn't guaranteed. But moments like this make it possible. And once the audience sees it, once they realize they can enjoy Paige's efficiency and Caitlin's chaos without contradiction, it becomes very hard to go back to the old script. The machine will try. It always does. The question is whether people keep clicking it. When everything settles, when the clips stop looping and the debates move on to the next manufactured topic, this moment will still matter. Not because it was loud. Not because it broke the internet. But because it quietly showed what women's basketball can look like when the people at the center of it refuse to play assigned roles. Paige Bueckers didn't crown Caitlin Clark as something she isn't. She didn't diminish herself. She didn't sacrifice competitiveness. She simply told the truth from a place of confidence. And Caitlin didn't need to respond with words, because the respect was already mutual. That kind of exchange doesn't trend the way controversy does, but it lasts longer. What we're watching right now is a sport at an inflection point. The old model relied on scarcity, limited attention, limited stars, limited stories. The new reality is abundance. More eyes, more talent, more money, more voices. And abundance changes the rules. It rewards clarity over chaos. It rewards collaboration over division. It rewards players who understand that long-term growth matters more than short-term noise. Paige understands that. Caitlin understands that. And whether intentionally or not, they're modeling something the league hasn't fully adjusted to yet. Stars who don't need conflict to be compelling. That doesn't mean the game gets softer. It means it gets sharper. Because when respect replaces resentment, the only thing left to argue about is basketball. And basketball, at this level, is more than enough. Now, if you've stayed with this video all the way through, that tells me something important. You're not here for quick takes or recycled drama. You're here for context, structure, and stories that actually connect the dots. This channel is built for that exact kind of viewer, but it only grows if people like you help it grow. So here's the technical part, and it matters more than you think. If you found value in this breakdown, hit the like button. It signals to the algorithm that this video is worth showing to more people who care about the game, not just the headlines. Subscribe to the channel if you want more long-form, high-retention breakdowns like this, because with a low subscriber base, every single subscription directly impacts reach and consistency. And leave a comment with your take. Whether you agree, disagree, or saw something different in that footage, comments drive engagement and push this conversation further. That's how channels like this survive. Not through outrage, but through informed viewers choosing to stick around. And if this moment is any indication, the future of women's basketball belongs to people who actually watch the game.